Talks, I'm Mike Collins. Mixed status families, those whose members have different immigration statuses, are growing in number. And later in the program, we will hear from an award-winning children's author about his latest work, which helps children understand this situation, and about the power of literature to cultivate diversity. First, though, the rising acceptance of CBD. That's the chemical found in cannabis, despite ongoing questions about its legality. CBD has quickly entered the mainstream, and although sellers cannot claim any medical benefits, many users swear by it as they treat their own health issues, as far-ranging as epilepsy and chronic pain. Meanwhile, North Carolina is on the verge of experiencing the CBD source plant hemp as a cash crop. But there are still challenges, especially for growers, and we're going to hear about them in the first part of the program. Rhiannon Fionn is editor and publisher of Carolina Cannabis News. She has turned her attention from coal ash, where as a reporter she used to be called the coal ash queen because of her decade of reporting on that topic. She was here several times about that in the past. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And Blake Butler is joining us by phone. He is executive director of the North Carolina Industrial Hemp Association and co-founder of a company called Hemp X. He's been involved in the political and business aspects of hemp since 2014, both as an activist and a planter of hemp for fiber and for CBD. Welcome to you, Blake.
Thanks so much for having me.
So CBD comes from hemp. Last year, President Trump signed a bill that removed hemp and hemp-related CBD from the list of controlled substances that made it illegal, and yet both CBD and hemp still face challenges. Rhiannon, why?
Well, I think it's because of almost 100 years of fear-mongering. If you look back in history, and I've all of a sudden become a student of cannabis, Prohibition isn't based in science, it's based in politics. And really, where we are right now is because of the Nixon administration slapping back against anti-war protesters, really. I mean, that's how Schedule 1 came about. And it was really about marijuana at the time. He actually commissioned a pretty conservative group of people, the Schaefer Commission, to look into cannabis and whether or not it should be prohibited or not. And to his surprise, they came back and said, no, it shouldn't be prohibited. And it remained on Schedule 1 anyway.
So when you say cannabis, people immediately think marijuana, not hemp. And CBD comes from hemp, and it is cannabis.
It's confusing. Right? So I've been explaining this like I explain the tomatoes in my garden. So I'm an organic gardener, and I have multiple types of tomatoes that I grow in my garden. I have cherry tomatoes. I have what we call the big uglies. We have all kinds, and it's kind of the same thing. They're all tomatoes. They're all from a tomato plant, but they're different types of tomatoes, and that's kind of what's going on with the cannabis plant. It's the cannabis plant, and you can either have, there's a spectrum of cannabinoids.
It either has the THC, or it doesn't.
Well, that's not true, really. I mean, there's actually, people say over 100, but there are researchers in Europe who have found even more. There's hundreds of different types of cannabinoids, and we really only talk about two, THC and CBD, and that's in part because, people seem to want the high THC because of, they want the high, or they want the high CBD because they want, medical benefits. But research is kind of showing that there's, on that spectrum, you want something in between, and we have all these other cannabinoids that we're not even talking about.
And this prohibition that you talked about, dating back to the Nixon administration, actually predates that.
Oh, yes.
Because the marijuana and TCP used to be prescribed by doctors.
That is correct.
For conditions.
And in the 30s, the American Medical Association sent letters to Congress asking them not to prohibit this plant.
Right.
And again, so if you look back in history, at the time we were going through another, kind of quote-unquote immigration crisis from Mexico. And the word marijuana was really used in a way, kind of race baiting, so to speak. And then it was, the jazz artists are, which is, again, a way to say the black guys are using cannabis. And so for a long time, this was something that was used by people of color, minorities. It wasn't something that, higher class folks were using or white folks were using. They were more into opium and hashish.
So there was a clampdown on it earlier and then again in the Nixon administration. But
Correct.
There was also a clampdown on hemp. Hemp, and I'm going to talk about this later, but hemp is an extremely versatile product. And maybe because of its versatility, it too was clamped down on because people had economic interests in other things, like trees to make paper. Hemp can be used to make paper, tobacco, etc. So maybe other interests clamped down on it too because they had money, investments in other things. But Blake, could part of that also be, up until recently, have we been able to easily tell the difference between the plant that you grow just for CBD and for fiber, the hemp, and the plant that you grow to get a high? Was it easy to tell the difference?
It's all how it starts out, in the seed or the clone. And the Farm Bill specifically says when something is derived from the cannabis plant that's 0.3% less THC, it is now classified as an agricultural commodity.
But has it always been easy to classify it scientifically?
Well, no, not at all. And,
right.
And if I could go backwards a little bit just to add what really happened with hemp, and Rihanna is exactly right. Most of the propaganda war on marijuana was run by churches. The movie Reefer Madness was produced by a religious group. So what really happened in all this is the DuPont family and the Hearst family and others came to Congress and said, we need to make the other side of the cannabis family a Schedule I drug because we want to make paper out of trees.
Right.
We want to use petrochemicals. So this was more about taking the power away from the individual farmer, because remember, in the late 30s, early 40s, our government was asking the farmers in Kentucky and North Carolina to grow hemp.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned investment in political interest, because DuPont had developed nylon. Mm-hmm. You can make fiber, thin fiber, to make stockings out of hemp.
Yep.
They had nylon, and they wanted to make sure nylon won the race. Speaking of races, we're close to being a cash crop with hemp in North Carolina, and I'm wondering how we got so far so fast and how our production levels in this state compare with other states who are growing this, because evidently this is one of the perfect places to grow high-quality hemp.
Yes, for sure. I mean, our farmers are learning that it's almost in their DNA from the old tobacco days. Very similar. If you're planting for CBD, you're going to plant, you're going to harvest, you're going to dry that, and then you're going to take it to a processor. So we do see an explosive growth right now in North Carolina, but I can tell you the long game and sustainability for hemp in our state is more about fiber and grain.
Yeah, but as
CBD
go ahead.
is exploding right now, and it's part of the hemp fever that everyone is going through, and it's very valuable. But at the same time, there's still a need to tap into what was present in North Carolina: textile mills, educational training, agricultural training when it comes to hemp. And we have this infrastructure that we could tap back into. We just need capital, and we really need people to believe. That's the thing, to believe that the fiber and grain, the 3 to 5 to 7 year plan can bring back the smallest towns and the communities that need it the most. Because remember, as hemp and CBD now being categorized as an agricultural commodity, I think CBD will fall into an 80-20 basket like corn. So 80% of it would just be regular old CBD, and 20% of it will be specialized, clean, kind of like your non-GMO corn, your organic corn. I believe that's what we're heading towards with CBD. So a lot of people are really starting to look at how can they make an extract that makes a difference.
So I mentioned
that's where we're heading.
Stop, take a breath. So I mentioned that hemp is a remarkably versatile crop. You can make all kinds of things out of it: fabric, paper, plastics. It is a biofuel. It is a food source. I'm not sure what you would eat.
Hemp seeds, hemp oil, hemp seed oil,
and there's nutritional value to it.
Yeah, and that kind of stuff's been around for some time. Okay. Unfortunately, we've been having to import it from like China and things like that.
You can also make concrete-like blocks for construction out of hemp. And there is a video on YouTube, an old film, where somebody made an entire automobile that runs. Somebody
named Henry Ford?
Out of hemp.
Yeah.
Right.
And actually, Porsche has recently done something similar. And, it is. It's a totally versatile plant. There's no real reason why we shouldn't be making good use of it. One of the ways, you mentioned my past work in coal, I used to run into hemp in that work too, because it can also be used for environmental remediation, including with these old tobacco farms that used arsenic-laden pesticides. To become organic, these fields would need to be planted with hemp probably for a good 3 years, but that it'll remediate the soil and actually pull heavy metals and other contaminants out of the soil.
Can you then use the hemp that's pulling the heavy metals out of the soil for
Sure, you can
other
put it into
products?
the concrete.
Not dangerous?
You could put. I wouldn't ingest it, but you could put it into concrete, plastics, paper. Sure.
This is a miracle crop. Would that be too
I was
big a word
talking
to
to
use?
Representative John Anger last night from up in Asheville, and he was acknowledging, we actually put a video up of him on our Facebook page. He was acknowledging that there's been a lot of hemp hype and that it's kind of hard to buy into it because it does seem so miraculous. In fact, we were at a processing facility called Hemp Magic, and it does, it does seem a little bit miraculous. But when you start reading into it, all of these things are possible. And so when I talk to other people in the hemp industry, they say it's hard not to be angry at the government for keeping this from us, but at the same time, they're glad that they can access it now.
So it does have a duplicate, many uses. It has the non-CBD uses, and it has uses for CBD. The growers in North Carolina, Blake, do they care which kind of a product they grow or where the product goes and how it's used?
Definitely. I mean, I think that's anyone that calls me as a first-time grower, I encourage them to get a plan in place like any other business. You got to have a plan. And then to kind of touch on what Rihanna was saying earlier, I kind of flip the script on them and I say, look, we're the Heirloom Tomato Growers Association in a sense that you need to find a buyer for 3/4 of your crop. Mm-hmm. You really do. You need to go out there and, find someone to buy and work with you. And help. We've learned that our farmers are helping each other, sharing best practices. We're all new at this, so it's a very collaborative spirit across the state. We see a lot of small-scale farms out west, as Rihanna knows, 2 to 5 acres that are joining together to meet contracts, and then a lot large farms out east, former tobacco farms and others that can grow 25, 50 acres. But it's about being realistic, and you can always scale up.
So let's talk about the CBD. Let's talk about the CBD aspect of this, because suddenly, all over Charlotte, there are these dispensaries cropping up, and I'm sure this is a phenomenon that's happening all over the country. And these dispensaries have what they call bud bars. They have big jars of filled with this stuff that looks very much like marijuana.
Well, again, it's the same plant. Same plant, different makeup.
So without smoking it and realizing you're not getting high, or without baking it into a brownie, eating the brownie and realizing you're not getting high, how can you tell the difference? How can law enforcement tell the difference?
Well, that's a really good question, and that's been an actual problem. We've had, in fact, there's a case down in Florida right now where they, confiscated a bunch of hemp from Gold CBD, and it smells the same, it looks the same, it smokes the same, but again, you're not going to get high off of a hemp flower, a smoking hemp flower. But if you have anxiety, you might experience immediate anxiety relief. So, I mean, that would be one way to tell. But other than that, I think it's pretty
what
subtle.
Everybody needs to look towards is every dispensary, every retail operation should have a COA. And that is that certificate of authenticity, of compliance, that flower, we call it flower, not bud, CBD flower, was tested.
All right, and we'll come back and talk more about that in just a moment with Blake Butler from the Hemp Association and Rihanna Fione at Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Biggs Camera, committed to the needs of professional and amateur photographers since 1959, offering new and used cameras as well as full online printing services, rentals, and more. Details at biggscamera.com. And Mecklenburg County announcing new real estate values for homeland and commercial property in Mecklenburg County, available in the mail and online in late January. This is not a tax bill. Info at mecreval.com. Coming up tomorrow, it's Friday. It's the News Roundup. A judge rules the investigation into fraud in the 9th Congressional District race must continue. Mecklenburg County property tax revaluation notices go out to homeowners. Presidential candidates for 2020 have already been visiting our state. We'll tell you who was here. And after an exodus of doctors last year at Atrium Health, dozens of doctors at Novant are breaking away. Those stories and more discussed by our roundtable of reporters tomorrow at 9.
Should governments pay ransom to terrorists? U.S. policy has been firm. We do not negotiate. But countries like Germany, France, and Spain do, and they've secured the release of their citizens. Reporter Joel Simon has worked on dozens of hostage cases. He says no one should die for a policy that does not work. We'll hear why next time on 1A.
That conversation coming up at 10 following Charlotte Talks with Mike Collins on 90.7 WFAE, Charlotte's NPR news source.
It's Charlotte Talks on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE and 90.3 WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. We're talking about hemp and CBD and the proliferation of both in North Carolina. We've become one of the leading states for the growing of the hemp plant, particularly the one that does not have a lot of THC in it, which is the marijuana plant that gives you the high. CBD does not. Rihanna Fione writes about this. She's the editor and publisher of Carolina Cannabis News. Blake Butler joins us by phone from Asheville. He's the executive director of the North Carolina Industrial Hemp Association. CBD is gaining popularity here and around the country. I alluded to those dispensaries that have bud bars here in Charlotte. And on WFAE, our Nick DeLa says that at least 6 new CBD stores have opened here in just the last year, and other restaurants and stores have begun incorporating CBD into their menus, but all of them are operating in kind of a gray legal area. Why?
Well, for one thing, there's a difference between full spectrum and isolate, and Blake might be able to speak to this a little bit better. In talking with some attorneys like Rod Kite up in Asheville, what he was saying is that humans have been using cannabis for a very, very long time. So when you're using the full spectrum products, that's something that the government's going to have a really difficult time.
Full spectrum products are the ones that have the THC in it?
No, not necessarily. They're just not isolated.
I'm completely confused.
So like CBD,
it's naturally occurring CBD in a full spectrum product. It's naturally occurring CBD after you extract it from the flower.
All right, so CBD. What is the magic there? Because the FDA says, except in one case, they said that they're worried that the use of CBD to treat medical conditions could keep patients from accessing more, quote, appropriate, recognized treatments. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, they have approved a drug derived from CBD oil to treat seizures in 2 rare forms of epilepsy. So does it or does it not
so there
have
again,
medicinal property?
You're talking about a CBD isolate where they've taken away everything but that CBD molecule.
Okay.
If when you're looking at the full spectrum, you're not only looking at CBD, but CBDG, CBD THCV, which is like an in-between between THC and CBD. I mean, it does get really, really complicated. And again, we tend to only talk about 2 cannabinoids. But what we're not talking about is our endocannabinoid system in our body. In fact, we even ran a story that was basically like the endocannabinoid system. You have one, just like you have a respiratory system and a skeletal system. We have an endocannabinoid system that we basically have been ignoring, and our body actually makes cannabinoids, but we don't always make enough, and so that's when you supplement with the CBD. But at the same time, there's just such a lack of information out there. It's hard to know how much you need and what type you should take.
Well, so as we pointed out, prior to Prohibition, this plant was grown openly, and people used it, and doctors prescribed marijuana.
Our founding fathers insisted farmers grow it, and that was in Britain, India, all over the world.
And so there are all these different varieties of this CBD that comes out, and people have been using it for medicinal purposes, home remedies to treat all kinds of ailments, and it seems to work. So I'm curious, Blake, why there's been, or maybe there has been, and they've suppressed it, why has there been no scientific research that says, yes, this does in fact have an impact on whatever condition you're using it for?
Because it's been a Schedule I drug till December, and that's the difference. Because all the FDA has done to this point is state a position. They've never enforced it. So they got to get back together in February and restate their position. We've already had 2 senators write a letter to them. As you know, no one's home at the FDA or the USDA right now because of the government shutdown. But what they've said is your position before needs to change because now we're growing hemp inside the U.S. Just so everyone understands, we've been ingesting $600 million worth of hemp products each year in the U.S., and all the hemp is coming from China and Canada. So FDA inspectors have been flying to China and inspecting these factories once a year to be sure they're safe to bring hemp into our country. So I don't know why the FDA would put up any additional roadblocks for inspection or anything else when we've opened this opportunity up to our farmers.
And I remember talking, I think, to Kelly Alexander about it 2 or 3 years ago, that because it was a Schedule I drug, you had to get all of your supply, if you wanted to do any testing on it at all, from one particular location that the FDA controlled. Otherwise, you couldn't grow it.
Talking about in Mississippi?
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Where they, honestly, if you look at their farming practices there, they're subpar. That's just such a...
So
it's so crappy that was our source for a long time when we have farmers doing a better job.
So help
here.
me understand this. All the stuff that we're using now comes in from China. Now that we're growing
or
it,
Canada,
and now that we're growing it here, we have farmers here and all over the country growing this hemp now legally. Mm-hmm. But it is still, if I don't misunderstand this, it is still illegal for consumers for this stuff to cross state lines and for consumers to buy it.
That's their position, but they've never enforced it.
But you can buy it on the internet.
Right.
Right, exactly. So, again, know that, the Senate overwhelmingly passed it. There is plenty of people in the FDA's and the USDA's ear right now, and they're going to have to get together as soon as they get back to D.C. and figure this out, because the USDA has jurisdiction now over hemp and CBD. Mm-hmm. So the FDA is going to figure out what is our role, what's our play now that it's an agricultural commodity, because it really does change everything. Every opinion they formed before was based on it was a Schedule I drug federally.
Okay.
So everything will change.
Because of this murkiness in the law, it's been very difficult for a lot of distributors of CBD products and also the growers of hemp to get financing and to be able to use banks. Some banks refuse to let you have an account with them.
They'll shut them down. They'll let them start an account. They'll even call it high risk and charge them extra fees. And then they'll be in the middle of a transaction, and all of a sudden they can't
Doesn't work.
Yeah,
because Venmo, PayPal, Google Pay, Apple Pay, other electronic methods they've stopped it. They won't let you use them.
Often with no warning.
So is that because of concerns surrounding legality and which way the government might come down on this on any given day, or is it some lingering stigma from the past?
A little bit of both, I think. We've interviewed some people from the NC Banking Commission about this. So now that we have the Farm Bill, what they're saying is expect changes on this front, expect to have crop insurance soon, but they need to let their lawyers kind of go through the bill, and they expect that to take many months before banking practices open up.
She just said crop insurance, and I know that during, I think it was the latest hurricane, Florence, a lot of farmers lost their crops, and among those crops were hemp growers, and they did not have crop insurance because you can't get it, so they lost their entire crop. What kind of an impact has that had on the industry here, Blake?
Well, I definitely there was a few farmers that lost most of their harvest, and I think that, like I said before, it puts you in a realistic position, or did I go too big? Should I scale back? And should I reapproach it with a security blanket, which is crop insurance? And, the Farm Bill allows for that, and we have insurance companies joining our association every day.
What is the size?
They're starting to engage. They want to help our growers and our farmers. And the banking industry here in North Carolina is opening up, too. The banks are being much more friendly after the passage of the Farm Bill.
What is the size of the hemp growing industry in North Carolina? How many farms or farmers are we talking about? How many acres have been planted with hemp?
Well, right now we have 585 growers that have been approved by the state. And we have over 2 million square feet of greenhouse space and indoor grows. So, just again, so your listeners know, those indoor grows and greenhouses, those are for CBD. So you're going to plant, indoors for CBD. So that's real significant because in a greenhouse or an indoor grow, you can harvest 3 times a year.
So if you scaled this up to what tobacco used to be when everybody smoked, what would this mean to the economy of North Carolina? What would it mean to farmers in North Carolina who have lost a lot of productivity because the demand for tobacco has decreased, I would think, a lot since the 1950s? What would it mean?
Well, I think it would be very significant because I have gone across the state and visited the Kingstons, the Goldsboroughs, the Pittsburghs of the world, and they need a new agricultural opportunity, a new agricultural commodity to bring these towns back to life. And as I mentioned before, if we really do envision what we had set up in the past with tobacco and the Burley Tobacco Co-ops, it's about coming together and figuring out how to bring these places back to life with a new crop. And so we're trying to be very strategic, and I'm really charged with being sure no one goes out there too big, and and I want everybody to be successful and sustainable, but I think we're going to have to, once again, look at it from a statewide basis and who can do what. And I think that, like I said before, down east we're seeing large grows start, and out west we're seeing more greenhouses being put up. So I think at the end of this year we'll have a totally different landscape across North Carolina as far as our hemp grows go.
I want to touch on CBD one more time,
Sure.
because these locations, these places you can go to buy CBD products are cropping up all over town. The FDA says because it has not been proven to be medicinally effective on anything except these two highly rare forms of epilepsy, you cannot market CBD as having medicinal products. But clearly people use it for that, and I'm told that retailers are suggesting that CBD.
I hope they're not, because they can get in a lot of trouble.
I've read that they're suggesting that it will help with several conditions. We've talked about epilepsy, also chronic pain. Insomnia is said to be helped by CBD products. Is the proof merely anecdotal? Or do people let me finish.
Right.
Do people take CBD products and then whatever condition they're taking it for, that condition is relieved because in fact it is, or is it the placebo effect?
At this point, it's really hard to say. It might be a little bit of both, but there is definitely a lot of research out there. Unfortunately, it's not necessarily coming from our country. You often have to look internationally for this research because of the prohibition that's been in place for so long.
And what other countries, aside from China, obviously, are involved?
Prague, Israel, France, Great Britain, a lot, many.
Is the same stigma attached to how do you say it? Cannabinoid.
Cannabinoids, good job.
Is the same stigma attached to those products in those countries as it has been here?
I think to some degree, but to a much lesser degree. I think, here we have a special brand of fear-mongering going on. I mean, just yesterday or this week in South Carolina, you had the police and medical association and even the attorney general coming out saying that, cannabis is evil, basically. And that's just not true. That's just the old-fashioned fear-mongering a la reefer madness.
So this is one of those stories that will unfold over the next several months, and we'll keep coming back to it, I'm sure. And I want to also talk some more a little bit when we'll come back in future programs about what products are being made from hemp right now that we may not even understand. We don't have time to talk about it now, but we'll do it in future programs. Rhiannon Fionn, editor-publisher of Carolina Cannabis News. Blake Butler, executive director of the North Carolina Industrial Hemp Association. Thanks both for being here.
Thank you so much, Mike.
You're welcome. There are a growing number of families in this country whose members are of mixed immigration status. By one estimate, there are 16 million such families in the country right now. New York Times bestselling author Matt de la Pena sets his latest work, Carmela, Full of Wishes, in just such a family, telling the story of a young dreamer on her birthday. This is not the first time Matt de la Pena has used children's literature to address class and diversity, and he joins us for the remainder of the hour to talk about his work and how literature can work to further diversity. Welcome to Charlotte. Welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me.
In fact, you're speaking tonight. I think you just came from
Trinity
Episcopal, and you're going back later on tonight at 7 o'clock to talk some more about this.
Yeah, I think the one tonight is open to the community, so that'll be exciting.
Okay. You're a young guy. You already have 6 young adult novels and 4 picture books. Your debut novel, Ball Don't Lie, was made into a movie. Most of your books are award winners, but you went to college on a full basketball scholarship. How did this happen? Why aren't you playing ball?
I feel like I'm in the right state to talk about this. Basketball was my ticket to college. I became the first in my family to go to college thanks to the game. So sometimes I did write one poem basically thanking basketball for my profession. I never would have been introduced to literature if if I didn't go to college.
But you majored, I believe, in creative writing, correct?
I majored in English and psychology. I went to graduate school for creative writing.
Okay. Why young adult novels and books?
So, when I was coming up as an emerging writer, there wasn't as much of a delineation between young adult and adult. In fact, when I wrote my first novel, I didn't even know what young adult literature was. So it's one of those circumstances where the industry tells you who you are.
Really?
So the book was marketed as a young adult. In fact, I had to change a couple things in the first book to make it more of a young adult title.
So what is young adult? Is it the Hardy Boys? Is it? I'm old. So
Yeah, no.
My
This is
references
fair.
are going to be Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, things
Sure.
like that.
You know, it's evolving as we speak. It used to be sort of a younger category. Now it's really hard to tell the difference. The way I describe it is this. If you're writing about a 17-year-old character who's living today and narrating from that perspective of being 17, it's young adult. If you're writing about a 17-year-old character, but the character's 50 now and looking back, it's an adult novel. So that's the way I delineate it.
And when you write books that appeal to young adults, do you have to change vocabulary or style, or is it simply writing about their experience that they can relate to it?
Yeah, so I think there are different forms of young adult literature. For me, I try to put it right into a community like I grew up in. I grew up right on the border of Mexico and San Diego, in San Diego. And so for me, it's more of an immediate thing. If I'm going to write an adult short story, I could be a little bit more patient. If I'm writing young adult, I want to get to it quicker. But I will also tell you that 70% of readers of young adult literature are adults.
I'm not going to ask you how old you are. I know you're young, but you're not that young.
Older than you think.
Okay. How long can a person write young adult novels? Because the farther away you get from 17, not only has society changed, but your memories of what it was like to be that age.
I think that's a
drop
great
off.
question. I will be candid. That's a question I'm really thinking about a lot. When I was first writing young adult novels, it felt natural. It was like I was just there, and
Right.
This is the perfect thing to think back to. As I get older, I'm finding myself doing more picture books and wanting to do middle grade, which is a little younger than young adult. And I'm not sure why. Well, maybe it's because I'm a parent now. I have 2 children, and so I'm thinking through that earlier stage.
How old are they?
4 and 8 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
I want to talk when we come back from the break about your latest book, which is a picture book.
Yes.
I don't know that I've talked to a lot of people who do picture books, and you do this by design in addition to your novels. That's a whole different skill, it would seem to me, and certainly a different audience.
Sure, it is.
And we'll come back and talk about that, and particularly about Carmela Full of Wishes, which is your latest book. We're talking to Matt de la Peña, who's in town. He's a New York Times best-selling author, Newbery Medal recipient. That's the highest award that you can get for young adult literature. And we'll talk about the function of literature in today's society for young adults, particularly when it comes to immigration issues. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from WFAE members and Terpening Law, 2 decades of experience handling complicated criminal and civil matters in the North Carolina federal courts for executives, professionals, and their businesses. Online at terpeninglaw.com. And Throwing Words, offering programs designed to help companies tap employee strengths to build better, more productive teams. More about Throwing Words Strengths Workshop at throwingwords.com/radio. The U.S. has long said it does not negotiate with terrorists. The kidnapping of journalist James Foley in 2012 and his execution 2 years later by the Islamic State prompted a review of America's no-concession stance. The conclusion? Countries that pay up tend to get their people home alive. Should the U.S. rethink the way it handles Americans held hostage abroad? That's the topic in 20 minutes at 10 o'clock during 1A with Joshua Johnson. And we will be right back with Matt de la Peña.
It's your world. We help you explore it.
The future of Brexit is uncertain this morning. So is the future for Prime Minister Theresa May.
It's your community. We help you understand it.
If you stand on a bridge above the Monroe Expressway, you can hear the roar of the occasional car or 18-wheeler rushing beneath you.
WFAE's Morning Edition is an essential way to start your day and stay connected to your world. Listen weekday mornings from 5 to 9 on 90.7 WFAE.
It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. Matt De La Pena is our guest in this segment. He is a New York Times best-selling author. His latest book is called Carmela, Full of Wishes. It is a picture book. And that would tell me that it's obviously aimed at much younger readers than young adults. And yet, you're dealing in this book with a topic that has sharply divided adults. Immigration. And it features a girl who is part of a category of immigrants that has also sharply divided us. Dreamers. In this book, well, is this book, I guess is the question, is this book aimed at young people like Carmela, dreamers, immigrants, or at other young people who may not understand who or what dreamers are?
It's a good question. So I think traditionally this kind of book would be marketed to dreamers. And I think what we're starting to understand is children's literature is a great window for kids growing up that don't have that experience. So it's really hard to hate a certain group of people if you're being asked to read a story from their point of view. Because then you see the humanity. It's the human part of that experience. So I would say for both.
So she lives in a mixed status family. For those who may not understand what that is, what is it?
So it's where one or more of the family members has a different immigration status than everybody else. So Carmela's dad has actually been deported. He's not a citizen, but her mom is. So she's dealing with two statuses in the same family.
They say you're right from what you know.
Yeah.
Do you know this personally?
I do. So my
family?
Well, my dad is Mexican.
Okay.
My mom is white, so I'm a mixed race person. But my dad's parents immigrated from Mexico so he could be born in San Diego. So his dad never became a citizen, ended up going back to Mexico. His mom became a citizen, and my grandmother lived here.
So Carmela, in Carmela Full of Wishes, is a fictional character, but she's certainly not alone. As I mentioned, there are 16 million mixed status families in this country right now, and you point out that is not just a number, a stat. It's important to humanize statistics with narrative. In our current political climate, the narrative is often at odds with the statistics, which are the facts. And the narrative has been used to demonize rather than humanize those statistics, those numbers, those facts. Can a writer, such as yourself, have an influence and impact our political rhetoric?
So when I'm writing a book, my purpose isn't to provide answers. My purpose is to ask interesting questions. So I don't have the answers personally, but I can tell you the story of this beautiful girl who has a sibling, rivalry with her older brother, and they're existing in a migrant community in Northern California, and you can just follow her for a while. Now, I don't put the issue, quote unquote, into the forefront. It's just the subtext. It's sort of like it's a brother-sister story sitting on a much greater story that's kind of quiet. So
it's their reality.
Exactly. A kid who's reading the book can enter it from different places. So it might just be you're reading the book and responding to the brother-sister sibling story. But you also might look at the deeper story after you've read it 3 or 4 times with a parent or in school, and you might start to look at, oh, this is immigration in America.
When you wrote this book, and when you write young adult books that are aimed at people who have a larger knowledge and understanding of the world. It's not complete yet, but they're learning about the world outside their family and their house. And obviously, Carmela Full of Dreams is for younger kids who are really just beginning that journey. Are you doing it to educate, to prick consciences, or are you hoping that this, because it's a picture book that will be read to kids by parents, that this will open their minds too?
So I think my position is representation matters. We need stories about kids growing up in homogenous communities in America that are the majority also. But what I try to provide is sort of a mirror for some kids who are seeing themselves in books, and that's a very validating thing.
Yeah.
A young girl growing up in a Mexican community right now reading about Carmela, it's like, hey, this is my life. But like we talked about earlier, it's also it's an opportunity for empathy for kids not growing up in that community. So I don't think I have an agenda. I'm just more representing a portion of our community.
So this is the second time. Carmela Full of Wishes is the second book, I believe, that you've done with a young illustrator named Christian Robinson, whose work is consistently praised in reviews of these books. You interviewed each other for a website. And in that interview, he talked about how the stories that you worked on together were so personal that prior to their release, he felt unsettled. He used the word vulnerable about how it might be, those works might be received. He's African American. He has not lived Carmela's story or that of her family. Why would he be nervous about how the book was received?
Well, I think he just wants to get it right. So he had to find his own entry point. And for him, in this particular book, you know, he doesn't know the immigration story. However, he does know about forced separation. His mother was in prison throughout most of his childhood. So he sort of focused on the feeling of what is it like to not have a parent in your close proximity. Our first book together was about an African-American boy with his grandmother taking a bus ride through Los Angeles. So that was me sort of leaning toward him. And in this book, it's almost like he's doing the opposite. He's leaning toward my story. So it's an amazing collaboration. That young illustrator is a genius.
Really?
Yeah.
Describe his work.
So here's what he does that I think is just brilliant. I write texts that tend to be a little heavy, and they're for kids, right? Mm-hmm. He comes in with these whimsical illustrations that sort of undercut some of my heavy, so it provides this really great balance. So yes, you can take the surface story of the brother and sister, right, and just explore that and just have fun with the pictures. Or if you're in a class or with a parent who wants to have the conversation, you can dig deeper into the subtext.
How did you find each other?
You know, this is the way it works. Like, it's just a professional thing where we have the same agents, and he was emerging as a new illustrator. I loved his work, and I wanted to work with him. He's the guy who has to say yes or no. So I give him a text, and through the publisher, and he has to say yes or no.
I've heard that some parents are reluctant or they're thinking twice about bringing a new life into the world in which we live because and I'm sure that you could go back in time in every epoch and there would be people who say, I don't want to bring a child into this world. But it strikes me that it is children who change the world. And they do it because of how their idea of the world comes into shape and into focus. And part of that process is through reading. It's through the books that they read. What role can literature play in children's in children's lives so that they come into a world that we don't like but can make it better?
Yeah, I think what you're doing at different levels sort of varies. So when I'm writing a picture book, I'm introducing a topic. It could be for the first time, immigration in America with Carmela Full of Wishes. When I'm writing young adult literature, I can advance that discussion, that introduction to the topic. What I think we don't do as parents and as educators is we don't give young people enough credit. They can handle so much more than we think they can. As a writer for young children, I remember thinking, what is my job? Is it to preserve innocence or to tell the truth? And for me, and every writer is different, it's to tell the truth.
Well, let's talk about that. Because you said a minute ago that you don't have an agenda, but you are writing about topics that strike a lot of people as being controversial, and everybody seems to have a very well set opinion on immigration, on dreamers, on what we should do with these people and what these people do to our country by their mere presence here. And you write books that address that for kids. And I read that you had your second book, Mexican White Boy, banned in 2017 by the Tucson Unified School District in Arizona. Is it still banned?
No, it got caught up in a larger...
Why was it banned?
So it was, I really believe it was the title. Most books are banned not because somebody's read the whole book, but because they've looked at one little sentence or one paragraph in the larger thing, and that's all they've read. Mm-hmm. So for me, I think my book got caught up in this program in Arizona that was, hey, let's take these predominantly Mexican-American students, let's teach them using books that are written by people that look like them, with names like them.
Yeah.
And so, politically, it was stripped away. And my book got caught up in that. So now I think you can read it in the schools. It's not officially banned, but it's not where it was before, where it was in the curriculum.
This banning of books has been around for as long as human beings, and printing presses have been around. I find it very disturbing, but it's because books contain ideas, and ideas are dangerous.
Yeah.
And a lot of parents are careful about what they let their children read, and sometimes they advocate that certain books not be allowed to be in the school library or the children's library, and certainly not to be taught in a classroom. Their motivation is to shield their children, to protect their children from ideas that they don't agree with realities that they would prefer that their children not be exposed to at that age, to preserve their innocence in many cases, also to make sure that the children think like they do, which is sometimes different. You wrote a column for Time.com saying that this is something we shouldn't do. And you just alluded to this, that we should not shield children from the darkness that surrounds us. Why not?
I think you have to acknowledge that adversity exists. In order for a young person to be good in situations of adversity, they have to have experience with it. What better way to confront major topics than in the lap of a parent reading a book? Like, I think that's a great place to sort of have a first experience with an issue. And that's what I try to do. And earlier you brought up this idea of the agenda. I definitely do not have an agenda as a writer. However, I do have a point of view. And my point of view as a writer is that kids growing up on the quote-unquote wrong side of the tracks are living beautiful, interesting lives.
But I read an article, I think it was an article about you, or maybe you wrote the article yourself, where you're speaking to kids. I think it was third graders. And this little boy, you had read your book, and you'd been answering questions that they had about the book and about being a writer. And this little boy mentioned that his grandmother had died.
Yes.
And he, at the end of talking about her, he began to cry. And at that age, you don't cry in front of your peers because it's weakness. But the other kids began to comfort him. And you saw the impact of that darkness sweep over him. Is that something parents want to have happen to their kids?
So I would focus on what happened after the book was read, which is the community came together to support him. They were all patting him on the shoulder and saying, it's okay. To me, that's what literature can do. It's not about the story so much. It's about what young people do with the stories and how they interact after reading the story.
When you write about immigrants and immigration and in your young adult works, and you explore your vision of the Mexican-American experience, which also comes from your personal experience, and with what's going on right now in the country, you say it's important to put this kind of book in the hands of readers of all kinds, Mexican-American young people as well as more privileged children living in a conservative community. And I'm sure that's happened because you're traveling the country about all of these books that you've written, and you've met some of the readers. Are you having that effect? Are you changing minds? Are you opening eyes?
So I would take away the personal thing and just say writers in general are doing this. I think there's no better opportunity to have empathy than to put yourself in the shoes of a character who's different than you. So I love it. I love going into schools. I love introducing topics to kids that are challenging, and I love watching them grapple with these things. That's what education is.
Does that happen at the youngest age, or does it happen mostly with your young adult?
Honestly, it happens at the same level with a kindergarten class and a college class. It's just different. You just have different language and different sets of experiences, but kindergartens, they go there.
Yeah, you mentioned the importance of diversity in literature, and we know the impact of what happens when people who have been underrepresented on screen, on television, in movies, in literature, in sports, whatever, see themselves suddenly. We know the impact of what that does to them when they see, oh my gosh, that's me.
Yeah.
That opens a world of opportunity to that person, because they don't see themselves in those situations. That's not possible for them. When they do, it is. It becomes possible.
I'll tell you a quick little story. My daughter, she's a quarter Mexican, a quarter white, and half Chinese. And one day we were drawing, and she did a princess with blonde hair. And And my dream is that eventually a girl like her with jet black hair will draw a princess with black hair, you know? Yeah. So I think that's what literature can do.
So let me turn it around because
Sure.
of a remark that you quote from a fellow author, Junot Diaz. You mentioned in another interview. He said that growing up he was a comic book fan, and he noticed that in those stories, monsters could not see themselves in the mirror. We know that vampires can. You say, maybe we create occasional monsters in our inner cities when we fail to show these kids a reflection of themselves in literature. Are you saying that we may have less violence, less angst, less hatred, less whatever, if people could see themselves in stories where they're not monsters, where there are possibilities to be successful people?
Yeah, and I look at it as the positive. It's like, what a reinforcing moment when you are actually the hero in a book or in a movie. I'm sure you're familiar with that recent Pixar movie, Coco. Mm-hmm. That did wonders. Like, I go into communities, I did a picture book associated with it. I go into communities of Mexican-American kids, and they just cheer for Coco because this is a major studio, right?
Right.
Huge grossing movie, and they were the star.
Matt de la Pena is a New York Times bestselling author of young adult novels and picture books for kids, all helping them learn about the world around them in perhaps new and different ways. His latest book is called Carmela Full of Wishes, and he'll be speaking about that and his writing tonight at Trinity Episcopal School's Freedom Fete from 7 to 9. You can get more information about that at WFAE.org/Charlotte Talks. Thanks for being here.
Charlotte,